What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Scouting the Fins right here on the 3 Yards Per Carry podcast, also part of the 5 Reasons Sports Network. The Miami Dolphins are 2-6, and this looks like it was an accident just based off their record. Just like how this Dolphin season started off as an accident, you need to be ready to. After an accident, your first move should be calling 305 800 PAIN. Better Business Bureau accredited with an A+ rating. Your car accident personal injury specialist. Fast connection with trusted doctors and attorneys. Always ready to take your call 24/7. Again, 305 800 PAIN. 305 800 PAIN. This show is also brought to you by ThompsonCigar.com. Use code 3yards20 for 20% off your order of $75 or more. Once again, ThompsonCigar.com. Use promo code 3yards20 for 20% off your order of $75 or more. Joining me are my two co-hosts, Coach and Eric. Gentlemen, the Dolphins for one Sunday look like a team that has rediscovered its balance. They didn't just end a losing streak, but maybe quieted a little bit of a narrative that everything was slipping away from them. But one game doesn't erase deeper fractures in this team. And this week against the Baltimore Ravens team that's statistically strong but situationally broken, we might find out who the Dolphins can become this season. It's not a matchup of records with the Baltimore Ravens also being 2-5 or 2-6. It's a matchup of identities. Two teams chasing consistency while the numbers tell a completely different story.
Yeah, they are. I mean, the Ravens are 2-5. They had their bye already. But I told myself a few weeks ago that I was not going to let this Dolphins team hurt me anymore. That I was not going to go into games with high expectations, and that whatever happens, happens. And I was going to start looking forward to the offseason. And then they go and they, played really well last week. And once we're done recording here, gonna take a nap for a few hours, and then I'm hopping on a flight to go down, and I'm going to be in person down there Thursday night to watch the game. So I am excited to see this team play after seeing what they did last week. I know the Ravens are a 2-5 team. The record doesn't say they're very good, but they're still a good team. Beating the Ravens team, beating the Ravens is still going to be a good win for this team. It's a measuring stick game. Obviously, still the narrative doesn't really change at 3-6 from 2-6, but you can't come out of a win against the Ravens and feel bad, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, they're coming back with Lamar Jackson too, so there's the added benefit for the Ravens.
Yeah, it's this is kind of you're 2-6, so you've already had quite a few litmus tests and you've already failed those. But I think that this is a big test in kind of the sustainability of what you saw last week in Atlanta. Because if you can play well and you can represent and you can maybe even win this game against Baltimore, and we'll talk a little bit more about Baltimore and some of their weaknesses this year. One of their big glaring weaknesses offensively has been their passing game. And I don't know if you guys have heard, but there's a really good quarterback coming back tomorrow night that should clean up, at least a portion of those issues for Baltimore. But just getting back to it, I think that this is a game that kind of shows it's going to kind of stress test the change that we saw last week for Miami as a marking point of, is this something that we're going to see sustain, or was that kind of an aberration last week in Atlanta?
Yeah, with Lamar coming back, it certainly helps their statistical averages because for the last 8 weeks, even without Lamar, they had a measly 6.89 yards per attempt, less than 0.01 EPA per pass, and a 10.6% sack rate. If we just go by Lamar's numbers alone, fourth best in EPA per dropback, 7.9 yards per play when he's the quarterback, which is around second in the NFL, right? He's got 9.1 yards per attempt. That's pretty deep, which is first in the NFL. He can throw the ball all over the field. He sometimes does hold the ball too long when he's escaping pressure, and he's got the rushing ability. But right now, even their offensive line, when they had Lamar Jackson and even with Tyler Huntley, the offensive line couldn't really sort out the protection calls, coach. Their running game, however, one of the best rushing marks in the league. They have a potential Hall of Famer in Derrick Henry, almost 5 yards per carry, 31 explosive runs. This is a ground game for the Ravens that still defines the franchise's DNA. But their 2-5 record suggests a team that has missed Lamar. It's strong in theory, but kind of fragile in practice. You can't necessarily run a modern offense when you have a 10.6% sack rate. That kills red zone rhythm, short yardage sequencing, and they can't really do well in third downs with just a 40% third down conversion rate.
Yeah, I mean, similar to Miami, that Baltimore offense is very much tailored to Lamar Jackson, the same way that we talk about the Dolphins offense being tailored to Tua. So when you put a backup quarterback into that offense, it's tough to replicate what Lamar Jackson does. I think the key for this game, and it kind of sounds like a broken record, it's going to come down to, the trenches, right? It's going to come down to Miami's ability to limit those first and second down carries, right? You're going to be in a lot of trouble if you're constantly in a third and short scenario where you have the option of, Derrick Henry still on the table, Lamar Jackson can scramble, Lamar Jackson can throw. Like when you have that triple option, you're really in a lose-lose situation. Whereas, if you can get an early stop, you can put him in a, 2nd and 9, 2nd and 8, then you kind of take Derrick Henry off the board for the rest of that, unless they convert the rest of that series. And then that also gives you the opportunity to get after Lamar Jackson. Like Anthony Weaver has drawn up some really nice schemes to get some unblocked pressures, and I expect that to continue. But Lamar Jackson, of course, is a wizard back there. He's, one of the toughest guys to bring down in the NFL. So it's going to come down to the ability to stop the run on the early downs. And when you have an open shot on Lamar Jackson, you've got to be able to get him to the ground, or at least slow him down enough to let the troops rally. Because anytime that you're sending those extra bodies, then you're taking some away from coverage. And when Lamar Jackson evades that first rusher, gets out of the pocket and on the run, right, that's where the damage is really going to be done. So just a matter of, stopping the run early like they did against the Falcons last week, and then, capitalizing on those free rushes, which they haven't necessarily done. I mean, they only sacked Kirk Cousins once last week, so kind of need to see that number probably increase for the Dolphins to have a good chance of success defensively this week.
Yeah, and I think that you made a really good point there with the way Baltimore's offensive line has kind of struggled this year. Anthony Weaver, one of the things that he does do very well is those sim pressures, and I think that Miami, you're going to see a lot of that from Miami. I think that if you're, and it's tough because Storm Duck going down last week in Atlanta, I think hurts you a lot more for this game than some people realize. Just having another guy that you could at least trust in the defensive backfield. But regardless, I still think you have enough back there to where, I think that this is a situation that maybe you see a more aggressive game plan from Anthony Weaver rather than, kind of sitting back, because I think you want to take advantage of this Baltimore offensive line in those situations and kind of create that confusion. The Derrick Henry aspect of all this is going to be extremely interesting. I think you're going to need to see the physicality that you saw, particularly in your linebacker core last week, between Tyrell Dodson and Jordan Brooks. Obviously, the defensive line held up really well against Bijan Robinson. You're going to kind of need a repeat of that in terms of having up Derrick Henry to force Baltimore into these situations where Anthony Weaver can pin his ears back with some of these sim pressures and create that, that chaos that can lead to a double-digit sack rate.
Well, the thing is, for this Dolphins defense, it's pretty much about stopping Derrick Henry. They stopped Atlanta's offensive line and running back room of Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. Albeit Atlanta's offensive structure was a little bit broken, you can make the same argument for Baltimore's offensive line, but they have a really, really good running back in Derrick Henry. They need to be able to put that pressure on that defensive line. Coach and Eric, we saw against Atlanta, they had a lot of different fronts with a lot of different personnel groupings to try and sell out to stop this run. But what happens if they can't? Because the thing is with Baltimore, if they're successful on early downs, you're getting them on third and shorts. But if you stop the run, just analytically, the Ravens on third and long, they're usually with 7 to 7.5 yards left to convert on third and long. Miami needs to be able to be in that position. But also with some of the personnel we saw Jalen Phillips be a spy a little bit. Just go ahead and just wait it out and then go ahead and rush and follow Kirk Cousins. Maybe we might see that with him trying to take down Lamar Jackson. The other thing is that even though the Ravens are able to move the ball, when the field shrinks, they collapse. 10 total turnovers, 5 picks, 5 fumbles lost. And that's neutralized a lot of the good they've done in between the 20. That's a team that can win the middle of the field. But, when you have those moments that decide games, that's when they lose. And that's something a lot of Ravens fans on offense and defense are very skeptical about Todd Monken and John Harbaugh. Like, there's rumors of Ravens fans trying to call for John Harbaugh to be axed just based off of situational football on offense and defense.
Yeah, you're talking about the defensive personnel packages there. I think Miami got to get a little more creative with that against the Falcons. I think we saw more sets that had 3 outside linebackers and 3 safeties than we did before. This past week, they also broke out a set that had 4 outside linebackers and 3 safeties on the field together. Last week, they did kind of increase their third cornerback usage again, which is something kind of interesting, but not too surprising given the lead that they had. But they didn't activate Kendall Sheffield for this game. I think Jason Marshall is trending towards playing, and he's probably going to be your nickel again. So it'll be interesting to see what they do from there, because in the 2 weeks previous, the Chargers and the Browns, they were less than 10% plays where they were bringing a third cornerback on the field, and they were much heavier in those sets where they had a third defensive tackle going with that 5-man front, or else bringing in a third safety. And definitely feels like Anthony Weaver is gaining confidence in Dante Trader being that third safety. I think that they used him a lot in that center field type role last week. Minka's getting to play a lot more closer to the line. Same with Ife Melifonwu. So, in short, if you can't stop the run, you're screwed against the Ravens. But I do think that the Dolphins have a couple different things they can do, whether it's rotating through those interior guys in that 3 defensive tackle set, or whether it's bringing, an extra safety on the field to, play down in the box. So I think there's different ways that they can get to that. We've seen Anthony Weaver do a good job with the run blitzes, and similar to the pass rushes, being able to get guys running free, kind of like that big play by Jordan Brooks last week, where he almost knifed in there for the safety fairly early in the game. So I think that, Miami has some different options as to how they can attack this Ravens run game. But if you can't slow down the run game, it's going to be a long, long night.
Yeah, if you can't slow down the run game, you better hope the offense can put up 35 to 40 points. But I think with all that being said, I don't even know if it's about getting them into third and long so much as it's into getting as much as it is getting them into even third and intermediate or longer. Because this is a Ravens passing offense that is really feast or famine. They've got some really good downfield options between Rashad Bateman and Zay Flowers. And I think that you kind of see in some of the underlying numbers with maybe holding on to the football, Mark Andrews as an underneath threat really isn't necessarily what he used to be. And I can already see this one being clipped on Thursday night. But this Ravens offense, it feels like they're kind of waiting for the big shot downfield in the passing game rather than kind of, attacking the underneath effectively. And so if you can get them into those situations to where it's even 3rd and 6 or 3rd and 7, you got to feel pretty comfortable with where you're at as far as that goes. With as far as hemming up a guy like Lamar, I do wonder if maybe we saw Jalen Phillips acting as a spy a little bit more. I wonder how successful that would be versus a quarterback like Lamar rather than a guy like Kirk Cousins who has a little bit more limited mobility. Granted, Jalen's a phenomenal athlete for his position, but he's not really matching up with Lamar Jackson. That's where it's going to be incumbent on, the guys in your defense to kind of be able to come up and tackle in the open field, which again, I think that was, to at least this year, the best open field tackling performance we saw of the defense in Atlanta. So, you got to hope that that's able to carry over in those situations when Lamar escapes.
Yeah. Before we head to break, Coach, I want to touch on the point for Baltimore's rushing offense. Derrick Henry is a better runner when he runs more so to the right side of the offensive line, averaging almost a .19 EPA per rush. However, they are much better running to the outside, well to the C gap when he's outside running towards the right tackle, almost a .3 EPA per rush. But inside, in between the A gap on the right side between the center and the right guard, he's got a .25 EPA per rush. What are some front strategies the Dolphins defense can do to limit a little bit of that explosiveness analytically and keep, Derrick Henry to minimum effectiveness?
Well, that's where that 3 defensive tackle formation comes in, where you can put, probably a Benito Jones over the center, and you can play Kenneth Grant and Zach Sealer more as a 3 technique. And I think part of the reason that Derrick Henry is more effective running off tackle is that, he's the kind of guy that takes a little bit to get up to speed, but once he gets up to speed, he's a load to bring down, right? So I think that, running between the tackles doesn't give him that extra space. Whereas when you get him running, outside the tackle, in the tight end area, he's getting 3-4 steps, getting up to full speed. And if you don't find a way to get him off path, we talk about the Dolphins wide zone scheme and the idea that the running back should be making his read by the 3rd step, making the cut by the 5th step. If you're giving Derrick Henry 5 steps and then he's able to make his cut, right, you're in a bad position at that point. But if you can be playing in a 3 or a 4-eye technique and you can get a little bit of penetration and you can make him go a little bit more side to side versus downhill, right, that's where you can, really have some effectiveness. I've heard some talk of maybe seeing a little more KJ Britt in this game in terms of somebody that will come up and fill a lane and do the same thing in that sense. Last week we saw a little more Chop Robinson in the game than in previous weeks. But I think that had to do with the lead they had on the Falcons and getting the Falcons into passing situations and wanting to get your best pass rushers out there. I think we're going to see Chop Robinson snaps kind of go down again this week, at least in terms of percentage of plays that he plays on the defense, and see more of the bigger body type guys, maybe, more Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb, the way that we did in previous weeks, to try to limit what Derrick Henry could do. I wouldn't be surprised if, somebody like, the Judons and the Bells get, I'm not going to say more snaps than Chop Robinson, right? But I could see their snaps going up where Robinson's goes down. Robinson's still going to be the 3rd edge. And then the other thing is just, timely blitzes from the secondary. You're playing in those 3 safety sets. every once in a while you got to walk one up and you got to send a safety through the C gap, or you got to send a corner off the edge. You got Jack Jones that loves to get his nose in there, sometimes a little too much. So, let him run, let him go, and let him wrap up a leg and rally to take down Henry. But I think those are just some ways that you can, slow him down from getting a full head of steam.
Yeah. Before we end this part of the show, the Dolphins' two worst gaps on defense in terms of rushing gaps is all the way wide right past the right tackle and up the A gap on the left side of the defensive line, which is basically the left side of the offensive line, which is the right side of the defensive line. That is a two worst rushing EPA metric for this Dolphins defense. And with that, we will head to break. And we're back. We talked a lot about this Ravens offense. Now we got to talk about this Dolphins offense that had a little bit of a change. But first, a little bit of the metrics of this Ravens defense. They match up very interestingly against this Dolphins offense. They're very strong against the run, almost less than 4.5 yards per carry allowed, 114 pressures, 9 sacks, but they're leaky against chunk plays. 7.15 yards per pass attempt allowed, 42 explosive passes. That's potentially where Miami's pace and space game can bait them on the jet motions, RPOs, and crossers. That stretch coverage. But they do have almost a healthy defense back this game up against Miami.
Yeah, I think with the Ravens defense, one of the things that you'll need for at least from Miami's offensive perspective. I think last week we talked a lot about the balance that was reintroduced to the offense. And I think it's going to be important for Miami to not go away from the run game, particularly if it struggles a little bit early. And hopefully their defense allows them to stay within a game script like that to where they can continue to lean on the run game. Because I think that when Miami is showing the balance, it opens the window up for Tua to be a little bit more efficient. And you look at what they were able to do last week, and it wasn't particularly explosive, although I would say, that maybe there's a little bit of a shift in perspective needed there, because when you have a runner like Devon Achane, running and explosive doesn't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive. He is the guy that can take the top off the defense in the run game. But I think it's going to be a lot more of Miami leaning on the run to get to a more comfortable, to get him into that rhythm to where he's just dropping back and he's throwing to his spots and he's hitting his targets. And I think that that's where you can really get to this Ravens defense is in the secondary. Looking at guys like Jalen Waddle, this is a game where I really think they will kind of miss the presence of a guy like Darren Waller. Not say that they didn't miss him last week. I think what you saw could have been even better. But I think you miss him, especially versus this Ravens team that has been a little susceptible to those intermediate passing routes. And I think that that's where Miami is going to have to really punish them again, is getting those linebackers to play up and just hitting them time and again with those 15, 16, 17-yard in-breaking routes and letting Waddle do what he does after the catch.
Yeah, I agree with that. Looking at what the Dolphins are doing offensively, Julian Hill is still out for this game, and they are not bringing up Hayden Rucci. Rucci played probably 3 or 4 meaningful snaps against the Falcons. Everything else was kind of, garbage time. He had a respectable number of snaps by the end of the game, but that means that, really feels like that sixth offensive line bringing in Brunskill is here to stay for at least another week, which is, I think a good thing by everybody's account. But I think it's going to be key to be able to not necessarily break explosive plays, but be able to run the ball with some consistency early in the game. The game plan that we saw against the Falcons is in some ways repeatable, maybe not exactly, but if you drew up a game plan of what you wanted to be able to do with the personnel that they have, it really made sense for a perfect storm type of scenario where you're using all three of those running backs. You're giving them different styles. I think it was either Mike McDaniel or Frank Smith that talked about the idea of using all three. That part of it is just making the defense tackle different types of runners. And then once you do that, then you can start to open up that intermediate stuff. And like you talked about, Eric, missing Darren Waller. I feel like the screen game with those Texas type routes where they were hitting Devon Achane and Ollie Gordon kind of replaced that in a lot of ways. So you ran the ball early, and then you kind of went to the intermediate stuff when they started to have to send some run blitzes and be a little more aggressive in the running game, right? And then once you're hitting that intermediate stuff consistently, that's when that one opens up to Waddle where he catches it, about 20 yards deep, makes a safety, take a bad angle essentially, and outruns him to the end zone. So I think that, looking forward to seeing more of the heavy set, seeing how Dan Brunskill grows in that role, because he was okay in that role, but I think there's still room to improve with it. But if they can run the ball early and then hit a couple of screen passes and then open it up for an explosive play later in the game, I think that's again going to be the recipe that you should be really looking for from the offense this week.
I don't understand why it took for Julian Hill to get hurt and Miami being down in the record 1-6 for Mike McDaniel to play more of like a controlled ball game. It's it's hilarious, right? Took almost 60 games for Mike McDaniel to play a very controlled game rather than a flashy, chaotic offensive game. Tua looked super composed than he has all season, right? 4 touchdowns, almost a .4 EPA per play, 57 success rate. It's not eye-popping, but the efficiency was surgical in the pass game. Uh, Almost 69% completion rate, 43% third down conversion, 65% touchdown rate. That's a top 10 offense by structure, not because of explosion. They've gone from highlight reels to more so heat maps, playing inside the numbers, controlling the tempo, forcing defenses to defend efficiency instead of spectacle. Now, they have sacrificed the big plays, but this isn't the Tyreek Hill show. This isn't the Jalen Waddle show. This offense is for the three running backs, for Devon Achane, for Ollie Gordon, and even Jalen Wright. The development of these three running backs, especially if the Dolphins offense continues to play in these jumbo packages with Dan Brunskill, with maybe potentially Hayden Rucci and Greg Dulcich as the tight ends. All of those guys are great run blockers. This Dolphins offensive line, their primary success is run blocking. So if you can go heavy against a Ravens defense that is primarily nickel based, that has 5 defensive backs off on the field, and you make sure that you're able to block them and force the second and third level defensive backs to tackle, Ollie Gordon can break tackles like it's nothing. Jalen Wright and Devon Achane have the speed to threaten inside and outside, granted, if they have somewhat of clean looks. The thing that gets me, though, in the run game and that passing game is that the defensive back blitzes that the Ravens sent. With this Ravens and Dolphins defense, they're very, very similar. The Ravens office defense is second in terms of defensive back blitz rate, and the Dolphins defense is third in terms of defensive back blitz rate. When I'm taking a look in terms of the efficiency of these successes on rundowns and passing downs, the Baltimore Ravens are completely better, which leads me to the point in terms of blocking schemes, Coach and Eric. This may be a game where both Cole Strange and Jonas Avenaya are going to be targeted. Eric, I want your thoughts on this first. And then, Coach, how do they protect these two guards with trying to run the ball successfully on first and second down, at least.
Yeah, I think it's exactly like you mentioned. You do have to protect them by running the ball effectively on first and second down, because if you open yourself up to being in those situations where the Ravens can pin their ears back, those guys are going to get targeted, and at least the stats say that they're not going to hold up very well when they are targeted. Now, with a guy like Jonah, the numbers don't lend themselves very well to when the Dolphins run between him and Aaron Brewer. So I think that maybe attacking the edges of this Ravens defense, where they do have a much better EPA per rush, running off tackle either to Patrick Paul or to Larry Borum, um, gets you in those situations where you can get some of those easier yards. And the other thing that I wanted to kind of make the point on with what you mentioned with the Mike McDaniel offense and going more to control is the Dolphins are sacrificing big plays for a little bit more stability, but it's funny, really, they're sacrificing for the ability to swing on big plays, because they weren't connecting before, either necessarily. They've had more long touchdowns in this past 2 or 3 week span, going back to Carolina and then the long touchdown with Achane versus the Chargers than they did in the first few games of the season. But getting back to protecting your offensive line, I think this is also going to be a really big day for guys like Alec Ingold, and having him in the backfield as an extra pass protector on some of those downs when Baltimore is going to be sending pressure. He's going to have to do a really good. Your running backs are going to have to do well in blitz pickup between Ollie Gordon and Jalen Wright, a little bit more of your physical guys on some of those passing downs. And does that limit some of their abilities in terms of the route combinations that can be run? Yes, but I think that that's going to be a necessary and ultimately, if deployed effectively, a fruitful strategy to kind of mitigating the aggression of Baltimore on those blitzing situations.
Yeah, I think a lot of the change and the finally getting the adjustments from Mike McDaniel to a more conservative game plan in that sense is out of necessity. When you lose a Tyreek Hill, when you lose a Darren Waller, at some point you have to start figuring out what the guys left do well, and that's what we've had the last couple of weeks. I mean, Cleveland did not go well, but you could kind of see a shift in that direction, that they are running less outside zone these last couple of weeks than they did all of this season. And even, going back to previous season, like they've only run it, they ran it 5 times against Cleveland and ran the ball 4 times using outside zone concepts against the Falcons. You're still seeing, you saw more inside zone last week than you did at any other point during the season. I think that's something that benefits both Jonas Savaianaya and Cole Strange. I think they're both better going north and south than they are going east and west. Neither of them have, great contact balance as offensive linemen, in my opinion. But you can find other ways to get off tackle and outside other than just outside zone. We've seen crack toss being used a little more than what it was early in the season. We didn't see it used much at all last week. Pin and pull is another one that they ran it once during the first 5 weeks, and they've ran it a couple of times each of the last 3 weeks. They've run that a few different times. So you're seeing a change in the types of run concepts they're using. I think finally adjusting to the talent they have on the field. I think that once they are back to full strength, hopefully that happens sometime this year, where we get James Daniels and Austin Jackson back. I think we'll see a shift more back towards that outside zone stuff and what Mike McDaniel really wants to do. But at least for now, and maybe that has to do with Frank Smith's, move to the sideline and some of the opinions that he's had on the game plan. But at least for now, it seems like they're really catering to the talent on the field versus what Mike McDaniel wants this offense to look like in a perfect scenario. And, Eric, you're exactly right in the sense that, they're sacrificing the flash and dash type stuff, but it's not going away from it completely. That's all still in the book. You still got that on the play sheet. It's just figuring out how to set that up a little better when really the only, Devon Achane is obviously a explosive threat, but you don't see that as much in the deep passing game. So really the only deep passing threat that you have is Jalen Waddle. So, you kind of have to set that up a little more than you would have had to in the past when you had guys like Tyreek Hill and Darren Waller who could stretch the field a little bit as a tight end. So I think that it's, a lot of it is out of necessity, at least it was last week. And it'll be very interesting to see whether Mike McDaniel, who does not have a history of being able to commit to this type of stuff, can finally get over the hump and stick with it this week.
Just one last point here I did want to make about this, because I think it bears repeating, is with the whole return to a little bit more of a meat and potatoes conservative game plan, it allows for a lot more of a cleaner operation in terms of running the offense. There's not nearly as many moving parts. Tua doesn't have to worry about, operating or orchestrating 4 or 5 different things pre-snap. And I think when he's given the ability to just kind of focus more on what he needs to do as the quarterback, rather than, okay, well, I need to set this play up, I think it just allows him to get into that comfort and into that rhythm like you saw in Atlanta on Sunday. And I think that that's a really underrated aspect of this change that we've seen as kind of a result.
Yeah. I think we're seeing that change since at least the Chargers game. Mike McDaniel has called around 47 plays this season with jumbo personnel. That's 2 tight ends and maybe Dan Brunskill as an extra offensive lineman. In terms of how the Dolphins are doing, it's not super duper efficient, but they're getting the yards that they need. If we're talking about in the run game, they are the second best in EPA per rush in those heavy sets in 22, 23 personnel with an extra lineman or Alec Ingold as the fullback in there. They have 7.3 yards per play, which combines passing and rushing, which is number 1 in the league. If you're getting 7 yards per attempt in terms of rushing or passing the ball out of these heavy formations, you're able to get first downs much more easier. You're able to move the chains much more easier. And in terms of running the ball, 6.6 yards per rush. Again, 6.6 yards per rush, which is first in the league out of very heavy 21 and 22 and 23 personnel. I'm sorry, not 21, just 22 and 23 personnel with 2 tight ends, Alec Ingold and potentially Dan Brunskill, replacing one of the 2 players in that formation. I think the Dolphins should continue that. It's proving to be successful so far with just 47 plays. But again, the winner of this game won't just earn a victory, they'll earn clarity. And what the Dolphins need right now is clarity, because it's not about who scores more or who defends better. It's about who makes sense. And we're all hoping that the Dolphins can finally make sense. As always, Coach and Eric, thank you guys for being such amazing co-hosts. I am your other co-host, Hutam Patel, and stick with us here on Scouting the Fins, part of the 3 Yards Per Carry podcast feed, also part of the 5 Reasons Sports Network. As always, y'all, go Fins.